Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmaswarupine avatara varisthaya Ramakrishnaya te namah. So today our moderator is absent. So just by way of introducing, today we are beginning a new series of discussion of a different school of Indian philosophy, not Advaita, but an equally important system of theistic philosophy. Advaita is technically called, using a Western term, we call it monism or monistic philosophy. And this is a theistic philosophy. In other words, it's a kind of a monotheistic system of Indian philosophy, devotion philosophy. Now, and the greatest exponent of this system of philosophy was Ramanujacharya. So Ramanuja was not the first great scholar or philosopher who expounded Vishishtadvaita. Vishishtadvaita had already gone through different cycles of evolution. You can find the roots of Vishishtadvaita philosophy in the Bhagavata Purana, in the Puranic literature, and also in the earlier writings of Yamunacharya, and even in the vernacular writings of South Indian saints called Alvars. So anyway, we slowly will introduce those subjects. Now, one may ask this question, and this is a very important question, a question that may not emerge in a classroom where you discuss Western philosophy. In Indian philosophical system, especially in Vedanta system, you find there is a gradual evolution, and there is a popular following, what you call a sampradaya, a tradition that lives in the hearts and in the minds of people, the common people, who may not actually study all the canonical literature of the specific system of philosophy, but still follow certain external rituals and practices and belief systems without necessarily studying all those philosophical books. I shall try to explain this further. Now, if you are talking about Vedanta, there are so many systems of philosophy which come under this umbrella category of Vedanta. For example, we have the Advaita system that we already discussed till last session, Shankaracharya system, Advaita, which teaches the one supreme, impersonal, transcendental, attributeless, spiritual, divine principle. 8th century, that is the time when Shankaracharya was born. And then Ramanuja came and he lived between 11th and 12th centuries. And he taught a different kind of tradition. For Ramanuja's system has something unique about it, especially when you compare Ramanuja's system with Shankaracharya's system. Shankaracharya's Advaita can survive as purely a philosophical system. There are elements of theology and philosophy of religion, but as a pure philosophical system, Advaita can stand alone. But Ramanuja's system is essentially a system of religious philosophy. So Ramanuja believed that the supreme truth is one divine supreme person called Vishnu Narayana. And everything in this world is a part of that divine person. That divine person is present in everyone, but still not purely identical. So it's called Chit Achit Visishta. Chit corresponds to all living beings, jivas, and Achit corresponds to matter. So Ramanuja's system is called Saguna Brahman or Saguna Sakara Ishvara, Vishnu Narayana. The Vishnu Narayana is present as Antaryami, as an indweller in all living beings. At the same time, it is distinct and different from all living beings. So there is some element of Advaita in it, because there is a kind of identity, because Vishnu Narayana as indweller, Antaryami, is present in everyone. At the same time, there is no total identity or oneness as in Advaita. So it is called qualified non-dualism or Vishishtadvaita. I shall try to explain as we go further, things become more clear. The third school of philosophy called Nimbarka, it is called Dvaita Advaita. And he also believed in Chit, Achit and Brahman. According to Nimbarka, Krishna is the supreme being and Radha is a divine principle, devotee. Then comes Madhvacharya, whose system in some ways is diametrically opposite to Shankaracharya's Advaita. He believed in the eternal separation, difference and distinction between different living beings, between different jivas, and eternal distinction, difference between all living beings and Ishvara and God. So there is complete separation and difference and distinction between everyone and everything, and also between God and everything. So I will try to make it Panchabheda Siddhanta. If you can think of a triangle, on one side we have God principle, Ishvara, on the side Jiva, individual souls, and then the world of matter, let's say Jagat or the world. Everything within this world is distinct from each other. Every Jiva is different from each other Jiva. And God is eternally different from all living beings, eternally different from all that belongs to this Jagat, the material world. And the material world and Jivas are also different and distinct from each other. So it's called the 5 kinds of differences, called Panchabheda Siddhanta. And this difference and distinction is eternal. And of course, Madhvacharya is well known, not always very popular, because he is perhaps the only Indian philosopher and the only Indian religious philosopher, so to speak, who believed that there are certain people, certain souls who are eternal residents in hell. It is called the Nitya Naraga Siddhanta, the doctrine of eternal damnation, which in some ways you can find in some fringe groups of Christian tradition also, in Calvinism. And there are, everything is predetermined. There are certain people who are destined to go to heaven and be liberated. There are certain people who are, of course, destined to live eternally in hell. So that is an interesting aspect of Madhva Siddhanta, Madhvacharya's philosophy called Dvaita. It's in a way totally opposite to and different from Advaita. And then there is Vallabhacharya, who believed in called Suddhadvaita. He belonged to 15th, 16th century. So he also believed in Chit, Achit and Brahman. Brahman is singular, is the only eternal metaphysical entity to exist, and by his sport or Leela, this Brahman becomes the Jivas and Jagat. So actually in a way, you can bracket Ramanuja, Nimbarka, Vallabha, all of them together you can put more or less in the same bracket with minor differences. And then there is the 16th century philosopher saint who was Chaitanya. He was more of a saint. In fact, actually it was his follower, who was Baladeva, who wrote a well-known book called the exponent of, the most active exponent of his philosophy, called Achintya Bheda. So it is called inconceivable oneness and also identity. So he believed Krishna is the only supreme Lord. You can find this Hare Krishna movement, Prabhupada, and our beloved followers of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who believed in one reality. In a way, very similar to the doctrine of the finality of Christ. It's an ideal in Christian tradition. So in ISKCON also they believe that Krishna is the supreme Godhead and he is worshipped alongside Radha. So all decide Chaitanya is the combined manifestation of Krishna and Radha, because Chaitanya was an archetypal devotee. So now all these systems are called, in a way they are called Vedanta. But for some reason or other, if we go to India, among the more scholarly circles, if somebody calls himself a Vedantin, very often he may be implying that he is a follower of Advaita. That's because of the popularity and also the great attraction that Advaita has created in the minds of modern world, not only in India, even outside. After all, if you listen to the lectures, if you read the lectures and teachings of some of the great philosophers, beginning with Vivekananda, maybe the first great authentic exponent of Vedanta in modern times, who expounded Vedanta in English language, who in a way introduced Vedanta to an age where people have already become familiar with the works of Darwin, his ideal of his teaching, his doctrine of what they call evolution as opposed to creationism of the Abrahamic traditions. And those who have read Karl Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, and also those who have read the writings of the great thinkers, free thinkers of 19th century, the humanists, the radical humanists and so on, the utilitarians and so on. So you find those who questioned, let's say, the established doctrines of creation and those who established the doctrine of evolution and those who began to question the idea that God creates his world and sits somewhere outside and supervises the entire creation. Those who could not fully agree with this view. Now, those people in the late 19th century, both in Europe and also in the west coast of America, those who listened to Vivekananda, they were listening to a system of philosophy which did not articulate the idea of a creator, supervisor God. Vivekananda was talking about a God who, as a divine spark was present, divine spirit was present in everyone and everything. So he created a lot of attention. And then again in 20th century, Vivekananda's colleagues and also other spiritual movements like Chinmayananda and others, they popularized Shankaracharya's Advaita. And then of course during the post-war times, you can find a great spiritual movement like Hare Krishna, who actually popularized this Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's system of philosophy, which can, at least to some extent, according to some scholars, it can be called an affiliate of Madhvacharya's system because of his emphasis on the idea of one supreme Lord, creator God. I mean, in the form of one aspect of Krishna or Narayana or Vasudeva, like that. So these are different systems of Vedantas. Among them, now one may ask this question, that's what I was trying to imply at the beginning. Why should there be so many schools of philosophies and philosophies and philosophers? If one philosopher comes after another philosopher, let's say if Ramanuja comes after Shankara and contradicts Shankaracharya's teachings, does it prove that Shankara is wrong, Ramanuja is right? Then another philosopher belonging to Advaita tradition comes and contradicts Ramanuja. Does it mean that Ramanuja is wrong? No, it doesn't mean that. So, if you look at the background, the emergence of Vedanta, Advaita itself, you can get a clear answer. Shankaracharya came at a time when Indian philosophical system was actually hijacked by both extreme ritualism and also a highly perverted form of Buddhism. Remember, not Buddhism, if you are talking about the teachings of Buddha, but Buddhism which had completely moved away from Buddha's central teachings. Buddha lived in 6th century BC. Shankaracharya belongs to 8th century AD. So you have got practically more than 1300 years of gap. So during this time, Buddhism in India especially, not necessarily outside, in India Buddhism had become some kind of an extreme nihilism or negativism. So there was a need for a universal spiritual philosophy of oneness and spiritual unity and harmony. So Shankara fulfilled that need. Then after Shankaracharya's time, again Shankaracharya's Advaita was again very often misinterpreted. In fact, there is something very interesting about the emergence of Ramanuja. Ramanuja's teacher himself was an Advaiti, Yadav Prakasha. But he was perhaps teaching Advaita in his own highly dialectical, doctrinal fashion. Maybe not giving much importance to the element of devotion that you find in Shankaracharya's writings in Gita Bhashya and also in his devotional writings, his marvelous Sanskrit poetry, all devotional poems. So Ramanuja's own teacher gave a very dry, a very dialectical interpretation of Advaita. So Ramanuja revolted intellectually, not in a violent fashion. He just gave a different interpretation of the same statement, which his teacher didn't like. That's how Ramanuja's system actually began to emerge. Remember Ramanuja's system, but Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita is much older than Ramanuja. We will discuss that in course of time. And then Madhvacharya came little later. Madhvacharya also was initially under the tutorship of a Greek scholar who was himself an Advaiti. So there again you find very often Advaita came to be interpreted in a very wrong fashion, in a very non-authentic fashion, as some kind of dry intellectualism. There is always a risk in that. People, even today you can find this trend in modern time. People tell you, I am spiritual. Krishna is the supreme being and Radha is the principal devotee. And this world and all the jivas are different parts, but still different from Krishna. And then came Madhvacharya, whose system can be called almost the exact opposite of Shankaracharya's Advaita. So you know the word Advaita, when you add before a consonant, Vyanjanakshara, it becomes the opposite, Dvaita, Advaita, the opposite of Advaita. In Ramanuja's system, there is an element of Advaita, because Vishnu Narayana is the supreme divine principle, Brahman, Saguda Brahman, is present in everyone. The whole creation and all the jivas are the evolutes of different parts of the supreme being. So there is some kind of a similarity and identity, at the same time different. So Chit Achit Visishta, that means Advaita conditioned by the distinct and different entities of jivas who correspond to Chit and material world, empirical world, which correspond to Achit. But in Madhva system, everything is different from everything else. If you can have a triangle like a God and Ishvara, either God is Ishvara, and on one hand you have jivas and Jagat. Everything in this world is different from everything else. Every jiva is different from every other jiva. and jivas are different from God, and everything in this world is different from God, and jiva is different from different entities within this world. The Panchabheda Siddhanta. So the total distinction, eternal distinction differences. After that you have got Vallabhacharya, who also believed in some kind of a devotional philosophy. Shuddhadvaita it is called. Brahman is a singular metaphysical entity that exists. And Brahman, by his own spot, as a Leela, creates this world or becomes this world of living beings and different entities in the world. Then Chaitanya Mahaprabhu came in the 16th century. Of course, the philosophical dimension of Chaitanya's system was enriched by a great scholar and saint in the tradition, Baladeva, who wrote a commentary on Brahma Sutras according to that tradition. There were other Jiva Goswami and there were other philosophers, scholars in Ajintya Veda system. So anyway, so these are different systems of Indian philosophy, all called Vedanta. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are two dimensions, because when we understand Ramanuja's system, you suddenly find Ramanuja is in so many ways different from Shankaracharya. So Ramanuja's system of Vishishtadvaita may appear to be different. So one may ask this question, why are they fighting among themselves? They are not fighting among themselves. From a spiritual point of view, there is no conflict. The conflict exists only from a philosophical, dialectical point of view. And that's why you can always find in the writings of Shankaracharya, who wrote not only the great philosophical works, but also the great devotional poetical works. In those devotional poetical works, there is so much of humility, so much of prayer, so much of... In fact, I don't know how many of you are aware of this. The most exhaustive, elaborate description of ritualistic worship in a graphic picture you can see in one of Shankaracharya's devotional poem called Chatusashti Upajara Puja Stotram. Upajara means forms rituals. You perform puja, Panchopajara, Deshopajara, Shodasopajara and so on. But the highest form of worship is called Chatusashti, means 64 upacharas. So the most elaborate kind of ritualistic worship is described here in this stotram. And you find in some of his great poetical works, the highest Advaita, where a devotee merges with his deity, and the distinction is totally gone. It is a kind of mystical experience, where the devotee becomes one with the deity whom he is meditating on whom he is worshipping. The distinction is totally gone. And the same Shankaracharya, writing philosophical books, you can find is expounding all these books as a great philosopher. Now what happened, after Shankaracharya's times, many Advaitins reduced Shankara's system to some kind of a dry, dialectical, intellectual, doctrinal system. And then that naturally created problems in society, and some scholars who were actually being trained in Advaita began to express different views. Ramanuja's emergence was like that. His own teacher was teaching him Advaita, and he didn't like that interpretation of a text. He gave his own interpretation. So the conflict was always between these new philosophers who emerged during post-Shankarite times and the views of Advaitic philosophers who frequently deviated from Shankaracharya's own system of philosophy. To give an example, this will make you very clear, and because before entering deeper into the epistemology or ontology of Ramanuja system, because Ramanuja system is very not as elaborate in its epistemological concepts, but I will explain this in course of time. You can find in Sri Ramakrishna's life an interesting incident. Sri Ramakrishna was one day practicing devotion. He was singing devotional songs in praise of the Divine Mother, clapping his hands. And then his Advaita teacher came. He was himself a great man, no doubt, Totapuri. But Totapuri made fun of Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna was clapping his hands. So Totapuri, you are making chapatis. In North India, in those places, they make chapatis with both the hands. So Totapuri, the Puri itself shows that he got his sannyasa, his ordination into monkhood from Shankara tradition. He was also a great monk, Totapuri, was an enlightened person. But sometimes these enlightened Advaita philosophers, sometimes they can become very dry intellectual exponents, completely forgetting the devotional element of Shankara's original Advaita system. So he made fun of Sri Ramakrishna making chapatis. Of course, later Totapuri himself had to learn in Dakshineshwar the greatness of devotion to Divine Mother. That's a different story. But you have to remember, Shankaracharya is the greatest chapati maker of India in that respect, because he himself wrote all these great devotional poems. Gadistum, Tomega, Bhavani, the Bhavani Ashtaka. Mother, Divine Mother, you are my only refuge. That's how these stanzas end. But Totapuri may have forgotten that aspect of it. So he was making fun of Sri Ramakrishna. You are making chapatis, But Shankaracharya would not have done it. So you can see the distinction. It doesn't mean that anybody is wrong. Totapuri himself was a great enlightened Jivan Mukta, a great saint. But sometimes this could happen. A great devotional philosophy or a great spiritual philosophy can sometimes become an intellectual doctrine. Even today, if you go to YouTube, you can find, I often mentioned this earlier, you think you are Buddha, you can be Buddha tomorrow. That sort of thing. It may be very attractive to spiritual adventurers, but it is not realistic. There is a great deal of deception and non-authenticity behind such claims and expositions. So I am giving an example. So very often Advaita came to be misinterpreted. And then what happens? Certain practices of the great Advaita philosophers also were not closely followed by these dialecticians who reduced Advaita into some kind of a doctrinal system. And you have to remember one thing. Any religious tradition that completely forgets or ignores or belittles its mythology, the religion is at great danger, because religion as philosophy cannot go very deep into human mind or human emotions. Religion becomes real, it becomes a living thing only in the form of mythology. Mythology may be myths. These stories have no meaning. These stories as stories have no meaning, but the stories give a great message. So, for example, if you are talking about, I'm giving the example from biblical parables because many of the listeners are familiar with the Bible and the great parables of the New Testament. Christ walking in the water or sharing a few pieces of fish with so many thousands of people, all that stories you find, right, is tradition. It may not have happened if a scientist will not allow you to go about preaching that without questioning, because it may not be accepted by a modern scientist. But the point is, whatever we see around is the only thing possible. There are higher powers which are beyond the human dimension. For if you say that if you pray and it produce a positive result on your mental or emotional system, is something that happens every day to many devotees of different religious traditions. But a psychologist may not fully endorse that view, won't credit with any scientific meaning or authenticity. But it's a fact that happens. Actually, religion lives in the hearts of people, millions of people, in the form of stories, parables, and beliefs. So, religion as a doctrine cannot survive. So, that was the reason why Advaita came to be misinterpreted and Ramanuja, Madhva, Nimbarka, Vallabha, and other emerged. So, before going further, I shall just give a brief survey of this philosophical scenario. First, in terms of tradition, if you're talking about Advaita, it begins with Vyasa, who was a Badarayana Sutra, and then Shuka, Gaudapada, Govinda, Shankaracharya. This is how the tradition goes. Shankaracharya is the exponent of Advaita, 8th century. And in the case of Ramanuja, you can find somewhere at some point there is a historical connection, but at some point there is a mythological connection. For example, Vishnu, Narayana, Sri, Lakshmi, etc., Vishukshena, Shatakopa, and so on. Now, after that, Natamuni, Pundarikasha, Rama Misra, Yamunacharya, Mahapurna, Ramanuja. So you can find many great historical persons whom Ramanuja followed. His own great teacher, was Mahapurna, and again Yamunacharya and others. So there are historical persons. But if you're talking about Vishnu or Narayana or Sri or Lakshmi, well, those names cannot be historically verified. Their history cannot be verified. So at some level there is a myth, but at some level there is history. We can verify. Any historian will tell you they once lived in this world. But Vishnu, Lakshmi or Vyasa, we don't say they did not live, but we cannot historically verify. Again, Nimbarka, Vishnu, Hamsa, Brahma, Kumara, Narada, etc. So Nimbarka is the inheritor of Narada's bhakti. Narada is the mythological figure. Narada's name can be found in Chandogya Upanishad, in the Mahabharata, in most of the Puranas you find Narada. So, but then Nimbarka can be verified, but Narada we cannot. Again, Rudra Sampradaya, Vishnu, Rudra, etc. And then Vishnu Swami and Vallabhacharya. And so also you find Madhva system. Vishnu, Brahma, Vasishta, Shakti, Parashara, Vyasa. And Purna Prajna and Madhva can be verified. But Vyasa, Parashara, Shakti, all these are great saints, names of great saints, but we cannot historically verify. There's a lot of history and also there is a lot, I don't say myth, maybe it's a wrong word to use, but cannot be historically verified. So also Chaitanya's tradition. Chaitanya's tradition is called Achintya Bheda. Veda can be called inconceivable oneness and difference. So there is an element of identity, there is also an element of difference in the Achintya Bheda Veda system. Now, just a few more important words about Ramanuja. Ramanuja was in a way very, very humane and much more liberal in his approach to spreading religious ideas. In fact, Ramanuja was very much admired. In his own personal life, you find, he was a married person and he tried to practice a lot of what we may call in modern times egalitarian principles. But his own family, his own wife could not tolerate his broad-mindedness. So he was born in a traditional Orthodox Brahmin family. Those days, you can imagine 13th century, 12th century. People were very conservative. There was a lot of casteism. All these problems existed in Hindu society in India at that time. So Ramanuja wanted to liberate religion and spiritual traditions from these social problems, injustices. So his own family members could not tolerate his egalitarian principle. And so he left and he became a monk. That's how the story goes. We'll discuss later. So, Ramanuja's system, as I mentioned earlier, it's not only philosophy, but it's also a religious philosophy. There is a lot of theology in it. And I shall just mention a few of his important books. The most important book and the most difficult book that Ramanuja wrote is Sri Bhashyam. It's a commentary on Brahma Sutras, Badarayana Sutras. So any great Vedanta teacher, Vedanta Acharya in Indian tradition, should write commentaries on what we call Prasthanatraya, triple foundations of Indian spirituality and Indian philosophical tradition. Brahma Sutras, Gita and Upanishads. Upanishads constitute the Vaidika tradition, the Vedic tradition, Brahma Sutras, the logical, the rational tradition, and Nyaya Prasthana is called, and Bhagavad Gita belongs to Mahabharata, Smriti Prasthana. So triple foundations of Indian spiritual philosophical heritage. So Ramanuja wrote his well-known book. His most important and the most difficult book is, of course, Sri Bhashyam. It's a commentary on Brahma Sutras. And then he wrote some other important books also. His canonical works on Bhagavad Gita is very important. I shall just give a list of some of the books he wrote. His from not only Sri Bhashya but Vedartha Sangraha, then Vedanta Deepa, then Vedanta Sara, which is an abridged commentaries on Vedanta Sutras and Brahma Sutras. And then Gita Bhashya, which is a well-known, very important book. So Sri Bhashyam and Gita Bhashyam, commentary on Brahma Sutras and commentary on Bhagavad Gita. So very important, most important of Ramanuja's books. Then also he wrote some books which are considered to be minor books, called Nitya Granthas, which deals with daily rituals and practices of devotional practices, mostly for householders. And also 3 hymnal books he wrote, Gadya Traya, Sharanagati Gadya, Sriranga Gadya, and of course Vaikuntha Gadya. These are the important books. His system is sometimes called Ubhaya Vedanta, Vedanta with 2 wings is called. There's also an important area of difference between Ramanuja and Shankara. We are from Shankara, we are coming to Ramanuja. So Ramanuja was very much of a man of the masses, if you use the modern language. During Shankaracharya's time, he was much older. Shankaracharya belonged to a much more conservative, what you may call intellectual, spiritual aristocracy of those times. So they won't care for anything other than Sanskrit. So something very funny. You can imagine the days when, let's say, when in Europe, many Christian theologians were persecuted. Some of them were killed for translating Bible from Greek or Latin into vernacular language, English or other European languages. It was considered to be a great crime, a sin, crime against man and sin against God to translate Bible from Latin into English or any vernacular. In medieval Europe, and many Christian scholars, saints lost their life. But in India, nothing of the kind happened. Such terrible things never happened. But it was considered to be appropriate to write books only in Sanskrit during Shankaracharya's times. And you had to travel 600 years from Shankara to Ramanuja. Society became more broad-minded. So Ramanuja not only accepted Sanskrit scriptural tradition, but he also accepted and revered the vernacular scriptural tradition. Now, if you are a linguist, if you are specializing in philology, you will know that the earliest and the most ancient language, speech system in India is Sanskrit. Naturally, Rig Veda is the oldest existing document that speaks about higher life, God or spirituality. Rigveda Samhita goes back to 4th millennium BC. But the next most ancient vernacular language in India is Tamil language, which in a way is linked to all the language systems of southern parts of India. It's a Dravidian language. So Ramanuja not only accepted the Vedic tradition, the Sanskrit tradition, but also he accepted the writings of the great saints of South India called Alvars. So, and their writings were mostly in Tamil. So he is called Ubhaya Vedanti. Means he accepted not only Sanskrit tradition, but also the tradition of the local saints and sages who were great devotees and who wrote in the vernacular, not in modern Tamil, but in a more ancient kind of Tamil language. So he is sometimes called Ubhaya Vedanta. I mean Vedanta based on Ubhaya means two traditions, Sanskrit and also Tamil or non-Sanskrit tradition. That's one that is considered to be a greatness of Ramanuja, because from Shankara to Ramanuja, you have to travel long distance in terms of social, emancipation, egalitarian ideas, the spread of egalitarian ideas. Society becomes more liberal. It doesn't mean that Shankaracharya was not liberal enough. Those times require that you should write in Sanskrit and only in Sanskrit. That's an important thing to remember. So, that's the greatness of Ramanuja. It considered to be a great, unique virtue of Ramanuja's system. And now I will come to another very important. It's not very important, but you have to remember one, the canonical tradition of Ramanuja's system. We are going to mostly discuss Ramanuja's works, and we may refer to Ramanuja's writings in Shibhashya, Gadyatrayas, especially who came after Ramanuja, his own commentaries with Ishavasya and Talparya Chandrika and so on. Now, a few words about the epistemology of India's philosophical tradition. That's also very important. It may be a bit dry, but it's a great wealth of India's epistemological tradition. Now, coming to subject. Now, if you just those who are familiar with let's say J.S. Mill's in the methods of casual analysis, called a system of logic according to J.S. Mill, method of agreement, method of difference, joint method of agreement and difference, method of residues, and method of concomitant variation, and so you can find relatively simple, or even if you go to pre-James, Aristotelian logic. But in Indian philosophical tradition, you find a very elaborate and extremely systematic heritage of theory of knowledge or epistemology. Ramanuja is relatively simple in this respect. Ramanuja accepts only pratyaksha, anumana, the inference, direct perception or sense perception, or inference called anumana, and verbal testimony, means scriptural testimony, agama, shabda, etc. Now, in India's philosophical tradition, and I want to take this opportunity to introduce you a very brief survey of India's epistemological tradition. This one important verse I'm going to quote, I'm going to recite. It's found in a well-known book by Narayana Bhatta, who is the author of Narayaniyam. The book is called Manameyodayam. It's a very, very important, simple, but highly popular and significant work on Bhatta Mimamsa. There's a verse which gives a list of all possible humanly imaginable possibilities of epistemology and theory of logic. The verse says, Charvakas tavadegam didayam abipunar bauddha vaisheshikaudu ba sarvajnascha sangistudayamudayanadarya sadushkam badanti prahu prabhakaraka panchakam chavayam tebi Vedanta vijñāha shatkam paurānigastu ashtakam abhidadire sambhavaiti ke yogād. There is only verse which I quoted as I explained this. It's an ancient verse from a 15th century writer, 15th, 16th century writer Narayana Bhatta. So he says, in India's philosophical heritage, the earliest and one of the most conspicuous schools of philosophy was Charvaka, means some kind of an Indian materialism. They believed only in one life, and they believed only in what they see in front of them, what they can experience with their senses and mind. So they accepted only one pramana or one means of knowledge, that is direct perception. They were crudest and also the most elementary, very, very ordinary beings who lived only to enjoy what they could enjoy with their senses and mind. The Charvakas. So Charvakaha tavad ekam, they accepted only one tool of knowledge, that is direct perception. Dvitayamapi punar Bauddha Vaisheshikaudu. There are two schools of philosophy, Buddhas, Buddhist and Vaisheshikas, Indian atomists. They believed only in direct perception and inference, that is pratyaksha and anumana. Ramanuja, Madhva, Sankhya, Yoga, they believed in three, that is direct perception, inference and scriptural testimony. Pratyaksha, anumana and agamam shabda. And Nayayikas, those who believed in the school of logic, they believed in one more. So they believed analogy also, which is a very important tool for all logicians, logical philosophers. Then there was a school of ritualists called Prabhagaras. They believed in five. So Pratyaksha, Anumana, Upamana, Sabda, Arthavati, presumption. And Vedantins believed in one more, negation, Abhava. And then going beyond all that, those who belong to the Pauranika school, those who consider the Puranas as the most important authentic books, all the mythological books, they believed not only in Pratyaksha, Anumana, Upamana, Sabda, Arthavati and Avalabdhi and negation, etc. That is direct perception, inference, analogy, well-better testimony, presumption, negation, but they also believed in some hearsay, some rumors, some common belief systems carried on in society. They believed that also. And those who belong to Tantra tradition, they also believed two more extra. That is, external gestures and also in what called the principle of what is left over, parishesia. Sometimes you may call, if you leave out all other possibilities, what is left out that you accept as the possibility. So I am giving this example, I am giving this long list only to create the right background. Because when we go to Ramanuja's system, when we compare Ramanuja's system of philosophy with Advaita and others, it is very interesting to keep this in mind. And another very important observation I want to clarify, I want to make at this stage is, though some of our students who watch these videos, this comparative philosophy, some of them may not be able to fully understand because they may not be so seriously interested in this system of philosophy. I want to make it clear that this series of classes is meant for those who are very serious, and those who can intellectually appreciate and enjoy higher philosophy and discussion or different systems of Indian philosophy, which also includes, please remember, Buddhism and also Jaina philosophy systems in course of time. So thank you. We are most welcome to ask questions. Thank you. Namaskar.
Hello, Swami.
Yeah.
My question is going back to
Yeah.
what you said about the story of Totapuri.
Yeah.
He was an illumined soul,
Yeah.
and be knowledgeable, and yet how could he not know of Shankara's devotional tradition with all that erudition that he had?
Yeah, that's true. Sometimes, even after getting enlightenment, at some stage, at some stage, from previous samskaras, it can come back. It can happen. So, you remember Swami Vivekananda was traveling in Rajasthan somewhere, and one Swamiji felt, I won't care for listening to those songs, and then immediately Swamiji, that when he listened to the music, immediately Swami suddenly, oh yes, the difference between a great spiritual seeker and even enlightened soul is, from previous life cycles, some samskaras can emerge, but they quickly get over that. Totapuri immediately realized it, and in course of time, you find he could return from Dakshineshwar as a much more enlightened person than he came to Dakshineshwar. So that even now you can see people who are expounding Advaita, talking about Advaita as it is some kind of a doctrine, some kind of a concept. Even today you find everywhere. So previous samskaras, previous impressions can re-emerge in the mind. It's an important thing to remember. This could happen. So Totapuri was certainly an enlightened person, but still there was something more yet to be cleared. That's what we find in the great master Sharadananda's writings. You can see. Yeah.
What is aitihiyam? Is that a pramana also?
Oh yeah. Aitihiyam is actually, aitihiyam has got two meaning. One is the popular conventional meaning, some kind of story that lives in the minds of the masses, which is transmitted from generation to generation. The other meaning, not totally different, but other meaning can be hearsay. In some cases, it could be some kind of a popular story or incident which is transmitted from generation to generation of family members, teachers to students and on. Another case may be just a popular belief which everyone knows has no real basis, but still they would like to hold fast into. But that also is considered to be a tool for knowledge by these Pauranikas, But remember, they're all fringe groups. Again, the other four, Sambhava, Aitihya, Cheshta, Parisheshya, they are all different extensions of inference, of presumption. They cannot be, they cannot have any status of as independent, valid means of knowledge, means of valid knowledge. They are all different extensions of Anumana, or called Arthavati and so like that. What do you call presumption or inference. Other philosophers won't give them the status of independent means of valid knowledge. That's all. So Aitihya means just hearsay. That's all.
Swamiji,
It is said that Ramanuja never used the term Vishishtadvaita. It was a name given to his system much later. Does that mean that there are more similarities between Vishishtadvaita and Advaita than differences?
Yeah, Ramanuja himself, of course, the technical name did not emerge at that time, but gradually, after Vedanta Desika, Venkatanatha and other commentators, it became an established system known as Vishishtadvaita. It is Advaita only. So, but remember, Ramanuja certainly had differences with his own teacher who taught him Advaita, Yadav Prakasha, no doubt about it. So, Sarvam Khalidam Brahma and all this. I shall just read one important verse from Svedasudara Upanishad, we can find, to make this clear. Mayam tu pragudim vidyat, mayinam tu maheshwaram, tasya avaiva bhudaistu, vyaptam sarvamidam jagat. It's an important verse from Svedasudara. So what it means is, Maya is matter, Prakriti, this world, and Ishvara is the Lord of Maya, Lord of the world. So according to Ramanuja, all these different living beings, the entire creation, are composed of parts of Ishvara. So they are not entirely, eternally different like Dvaita, because the Avayava, Sesha, Seshi, Sambandha, we call it. At the same time, they are not totally different, they are not totally identical either. They are not totally identical as in Advaita, they are not totally eternally different as in Dvaita. So, it seems that Ramanuja concept Aprutak Siddhi, that's a relationship between Jiva, Jagat and Ishvara. It is something very difficult to explain but can be experienced. So, it came to be known as Vishishtadvaita, at least in the writings of Vedanta Desika and others. And Vedanta Desika came, he was the great exponent and commentator of Ramanuja's system. The greatest Vishishtadvaita after Ramanuja, Vedanta Desika, Venkatanatha. Yeah. And then they claimed the ground for Vedas. But their interpretation of Vedas was totally different from Vedanta. They said Vedas are only teaching rituals, performing some rituals, some sacrifices, nothing more, nothing less. They did not take into consideration the higher philosophical ideas, spiritual ideas, metaphysical ideas found in the Upanishads. They said that all these ideas are just used as arthavada, means just to praise. If you perform these rituals, you get all this result. Like that, nothing more, like for rewards. So, during the debates between extreme cutthroat nihilistic Buddhist and ritualist Mimamsakas, the Mimamsakas won this battle for Vedas. But their own interpretation of Vedas was very, very lopsided and very incomplete and inaccurate. Then Shankara came. So he had to confront these ritualist philosophers and their followers, and also these Buddhists. So what happened, he wanted to prove to these Mimamsakas, these ritualists, no, Vedas talk about not rituals alone, Vedas talk about some higher philosophy. And Shankaracharya focused on the Upanishads. He said the Upanishads teach about one supreme divine principle that is present in everything, everywhere. that is one supreme truth. He proclaims the world unity and oneness, the spiritual unity and oneness of existence. And he wrote these commentaries on Upanishads, Brahma Sutras, Gita, and so many other books. At the same time, he was realistic enough to understand that everyone may not understand this higher philosophy of Upanishads. So what he did, he opened temples, he opened monasteries for teaching the Vedas. He even recommended different forms of rituals. Many of the methods of worship followed in many Indian temples. Go back to Shankaracharya times. There is not one great temple in India that Shankaracharya did not visit and pray in. Kanchi, Dwaraga, Puri, everywhere, Badri, everywhere. Benares, Kashi, everywhere. So, he traveled all over the country, went to all these prominent temples. He himself actually installed many temples and taught people how to pray, how to practice self-surrender. All these great devotional poems he wrote. At the same time, as a philosopher, he said the highest reach is the supreme reality. So in a way, it's proper to say Shankaracharya, within the same campus, he built a university, a college, a primary school, and also a kindergarten. All that you find. If you are a beginner in spiritual life, go and pray. No problem. If you want a job, go. Not only you don't have to go to a temple. In your own home, you pray. So Panchadevata Puja is all the householders practice. No, Ramanuja did not reject all this. Ramanuja's revolt was against a trend that he found during his times. That is, interpreting Advaita as some kind of a extremely lopsided, intellectual, doctrinal, dialectical concept, which totally rejects devotion. That sort of thing he could not tolerate. So, just as Shankaracharya was not contradicting Buddha, he was contradicting what Buddhism had become within 1300 years. That was what he was confronting. Similarly, Ramanuja was not confronting Shankaracharya. Ramanuja was revolting against a trend that he found in society. Ramanuja's system also developed certain other problems, ritualistic problems and all that. So, in India, the greatness of India's spiritual tradition is there is no total rejection, there is a gradual evolution. So, from a spiritual perspective, you grow, as Vivekananda said. You begin with Dvaita. You cannot begin with Advaita. Remember, if somebody tells you can find in modern world doesn't mean that's a curse of this UIT age. Everyone says in Advaita. You don't go anything, you are an Advaita, you are Brahman. That's not Advaita. Advaita requires some dedicated, devoted spiritual discipline that one should practice, and slowly you in your spiritual life you evolve. So it's a matter of inner experience and not a matter of intellectual conviction. So that's an important thing to remember. And Shankara's main adversary was Mimamsakas, who were telling everyone that Vedas only talk about rituals. And this another important adversary of Buddhists, who are telling that there is nothing in this world, everything is shunyam, everything is kind of nihilism. Of course, you have to confront Sankhyas and others, but these are minor problems. Okay, thank you for the question. Ramanuja has so much to offer to our times, He very realistic, very humanistic, and very devotional. So thank you. We will continue the discussion in the coming sessions. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.